In December of 1936, a 20-year-old Jewish architecture student boarded a train in Prague. He told his parents he was going skiing. In his pocket, he carried a revolver. At his destination, 2 suitcases packed with explosives were waiting for him at a luggage claim. His target was the Nazi Party headquarters in Nuremberg, the spiritual capital of Adolf Hitler's Reich. His name was Helmut Hirsch, and the bomb he was supposed to carry had been designed to kill him too. He just didn't know it yet. To understand how a young Jewish artist and poet ended up on a suicide mission against the most powerful regime in Europe, you have to go back to Stuttgart, 1916. Helmut Hirsch was born on January 27th of that year, the elder of 2 children. His father, Siegfried, was a veteran of World War I. His mother, Martha Neuburger Hirsch, raised Helmut and his younger sister Katie in a middle-class Jewish household where art, poetry, and architecture were not hobbies. They were identity. From his earliest years, Helmut showed talent. He drew constantly. He wrote poems. He sketched buildings with an obsessive attention to detail that, in another life, would have made him a respected architect. But Helmut Hirsch was not born into another life. He was born into Weimar, Germany, a place where Jewish families like the Hirschs existed in a state of permanent paradox. They were German in language, culture, education, and loyalty. And they were Jewish in a country that was learning, year by year, to define that word as a disease. Helmut grew up watching the shift, the casual insults that hardened into policy, the neighbors who stopped speaking, the laws that moved from suggestion to enforcement. And then, in 1935, everything collapsed. The Nuremberg laws changed the equation permanently. Passed in September of that year at the annual Nazi Party rally in the very city Helmut would later try to bomb, these laws stripped Jews of German citizenship, prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews, and created a legal framework for exclusion that would eventually become a framework for extermination. For Helmut Hirsch, the immediate consequence was concrete and personal. He was expelled from German universities. A Jewish student could no longer study architecture or anything else in the country of his birth. At 19, Helmut Hirsch became a refugee. He moved to Prague, then the capital of Czechoslovakia, a country that still functioned as a democracy. He enrolled at the Deutsche Technische Hochschule, the German Institute of Technology, to continue his architectural studies. And it was in Prague, surrounded by other German expatriates who had fled or been expelled by the Nazi regime, that Helmut Hirsch's life took the turn from which it would never return. Among the exile communities of Prague in the mid-1930s, there existed a strange and volatile political ecosystem. Not everyone who opposed Hitler opposed him for the same reasons. Not everyone who hated the regime hated it because of what it was doing to Jews. Some hated it because they believed Hitler had betrayed a different version of German nationalism, one that was supposed to be revolutionary, socialist in its own peculiar way, and uncontaminated by what they saw as Hitler's compromises with industrialists and traditional conservatives. This was the world of the Black Front. The Black Front was led by Otto Strasser, a former Nazi Party member who had broken with Hitler in 1930. Strasser's ideology was Strasserism, a form of nationalist socialism that rejected Hitler's alliance with big business and, crucially, rejected the biological racism of the Nazi Party. Strasser's relationship with anti-Semitism was complex and contradictory. The Black Front had originally incorporated anti-Semitic elements, but in exile, Strasser moved towards supporting Jewish equality and even expressed sympathy for Zionism. He recruited Jews into his organization. For young, angry, displaced Jewish men like Helmut Hirsch, the Black Front offered something irresistible: action. Not the patient, diplomatic, legalistic action of Jewish community organizations. Not the quiet endurance that most Jewish families practiced as the walls closed in. Direct, physical, explosive action against the regime that had destroyed their lives. Helmut was introduced to the Black Front through his former youth group leader, a man named Eberhard Köbel, known as Tusk. Through Tusk, he met Otto Strasser himself, and through Strasser's inner circle, he was connected to the man who would become his handler, Heinrich Grunow, who operated under the codename Dr. Beer. The plan that Grunow laid out was audacious. Helmut was to travel from Prague into Germany, make his way to Nuremberg, pick up 2 suitcases that had been smuggled across the border and left at a luggage claim, and deliver those suitcases, packed with explosives, to 1 or 2 targets. The primary target was the Nazi Party headquarters in Nuremberg. The secondary target was the printing plant of Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher's viciously anti-Semitic weekly newspaper, a publication so extreme in its hatred that even some Nazi officials considered it an embarrassment. What Helmut Hirsch did not know, what he could not have known, was that the Black Front had been thoroughly infiltrated by Nazi agents. The Gestapo had penetrated the organization at multiple levels. There was at least one double agent inside the inner circle who knew every detail of the plot. According to research compiled by Brandeis University, which houses the Helmut Hirsch collection, the bomb itself had been constructed to kill the carrier along with the target. Helmut Hirsch was not being sent on a bombing mission. He was being sent on a suicide mission. And the people who sent him may not have cared whether the bomb reached its target at all, because the Gestapo already knew he was coming. In December of 1936, Helmut told his parents he was going skiing with a friend. He boarded a train. His instructions were precise. Buy a round-trip ticket from Prague to Stuttgart, but disembark in Nuremberg, meet a contact, collect the luggage claim tickets for the 2 suitcases, and carry out the attack. But something happened on that train. According to letters Helmut later wrote to his family from prison, he was wavering. The commitment that had seemed absolute in the safety of Prague exile meetings felt different when the train was actually moving toward Germany, toward the country that had expelled him, the country where the Gestapo operated with total impunity, the country where being a Jew was already a crime. Instead of getting off in Nuremberg, Helmut stayed on the train. He traveled all the way to Stuttgart, his hometown, to meet an old friend. He hoped, he wrote later, that this friend would talk him out of the plot. It didn't matter. The Gestapo was already waiting. On December 21, 1936, Helmut Hirsch was arrested in Stuttgart. He was carrying a revolver. He had not picked up the suitcases. He had not touched the explosives. He had not reached Nuremberg. But the Gestapo had enough. The double agent inside the Black Front had provided testimony so detailed that only a trusted member of the organization could have supplied it. The trap had been set long before Helmut boarded the train. He never had a chance. What followed was a process that revealed, with surgical precision, how the Nazi legal system functioned when it wanted someone dead. Helmut was transferred from Stuttgart to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. He was held in solitary confinement for 9 weeks. He was interrogated repeatedly. He was permitted to write to family members who still lived in Germany, but his letters were intercepted by censors. Some were never delivered. He was assigned a public defender, which in the context of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, the Nazi regime's instrument for political trials, was less a defense attorney and more a procedural formality designed to give the appearance of legality to a predetermined verdict. The trial took place in March of 1937. It was held entirely in secret. No press was admitted. No family members were allowed to attend. The proceedings were classified. At the trial, testimony from at least one prosecution witness made it unmistakably clear that the Black Front had been compromised by an informer. The level of detail about the plot could only have come from someone inside the organization. Helmut, to his credit, did not deny his involvement. He admitted his role. His public defender argued reasonably that Hirsch should be acquitted because he had never actually carried out the attack. He had no explosives in his possession at the time of his arrest, he had not reached Nuremberg, and he had been wavering in his commitment. The court was unmoved. On March 20th, 1937, the Volksgerichtshof announced its verdict publicly. Helmut Hirsch, described in the announcement as the stateless Jew, Helmut Hirsch, was sentenced to death for preparation of high treason and criminal use of explosives endangering the public. The charge was extraordinary on its face: criminal use of explosives. He had never touched explosives. He had never picked up the suitcases. He had never reached the target. But the law, as administered by the People's Court, did not require completion. Intent was enough. And intent, in a Jewish defendant accused of plotting against the Nazi Party, was never in doubt. Helmut's family had been searching for him for 3 months. He had left for his supposed skiing trip in December. He had vanished. They had no information, no contact, no indication of where he was or whether he was alive. And then, on March 20th, they turned on the radio, and they heard the announcer read out the sentence. That was how Siegfried and Martha Hirsch learned what had happened to their son. From a radio broadcast, a death sentence delivered between the weather and the news. What happened next is one of the most unlikely diplomatic episodes of the pre-war period. Helmut Hirsch's father, Siegfried, had lived in the United States for approximately a decade before World War I. He had been a naturalized American citizen. After returning to Europe, his citizenship had been revoked in 1926 because he had taken up permanent residence abroad. But citizenship, once granted and then revoked, could potentially be reinstated. And if Siegfried's citizenship was restored, then Helmut, born to an American citizen, would also be an American citizen, even though he had never set foot on American soil. Helmut's cousin, George Neuberger, had moved to New York. He enlisted the help of an American lawyer named Irving S. Ottenberg, who was married to a relative of the Hirsch family. Ottenberg filed a petition to reinstate Siegfried's citizenship. The initial appeal was rejected, but a month later, the decision was reversed. On April 22, 1937, Siegfried Hirsch's American citizenship was formally restored, and by extension, Helmut Hirsch, sitting in a death cell in Plötzensee prison, awaiting execution, became, on paper, an American citizen. This changed everything, and it changed nothing. The United States government was now obligated to act. Secretary of State Cordell Hull instructed the American ambassador to Germany, William E. Dodd, to intervene on Helmut's behalf. Dodd was already one of the most outspoken critics of the Nazi regime within the American diplomatic corps. His own diaries, published after the war, reveal a man who was horrified by what he witnessed in Berlin and frustrated by his own government's unwillingness to confront it. Now he had a concrete case. An American citizen, 21 years old, sentenced to death by a secret court for a crime he had never completed. According to diplomatic records preserved in the Foreign Relations of the United States Archives, FRUS, 1937, Volume 2, Document 304, Dodd made a formal appeal to the German government. He met with Konstantin von Neurath, the German foreign minister. He met with Otto Meissner, a senior aide to Hitler. He argued on 2 specific grounds. First, the youth and emotional temperament of Hirsch, and second, that the death penalty was disproportionate and unnecessarily severe for a plot that had never been executed. Dodd also repeatedly requested, at minimum, a delay of the execution to allow the American government to review the case more fully. The German ambassador's response, also recorded in the FRUS documents, was categorical. He stated that Hirsch was intelligent, that he had deliberately joined a subversive organization, that he had carried explosives from Prague to Stuttgart. This was factually disputed, but the German government maintained it, that he had admitted his guilt, that the court was competent, and that the law prescribed death for treason. The ambassador saw no basis for further favorable action. If anything could be done at all, he suggested, it would need to come through the embassy in Berlin. Dodd went to Berlin. He made his appeal directly, and the appeal went all the way to the top. According to multiple sources, including Dodd's own diary and the Brandeis University records, the final decision rested with Adolf Hitler personally. Hitler was asked to grant clemency to a 21-year-old Jewish architecture student who had planned to bomb Nazi headquarters but never carried it out, who was technically an American citizen and whose case had attracted international attention from the Red Cross, the Society of Friends, an International Lawyers Association, and the government of Norway, which had offered Hirsch asylum. Hitler refused. On the evening of June 3, 1937, Helmut Hirsch was told that his appeal for clemency had been denied. He sat in his cell in Plötzensee and wrote a final letter to his family. The letter survives. It is preserved in the Helmut Hirsch collection at Brandeis University, donated decades later by his sister Kayete, who had by then taken the name Catherine Sugarman and built a life in the United States, the country her brother had been a citizen of for exactly 43 days before he was killed. The letter is short. It does not rage. It does not plead. It reads, in translation from the German, "Dear Mother, dear Father, I have just been told that my appeal for clemency was turned down. I must die then. We need not say anything any more to each other. You know that in these last months I have really found the way to myself and to life. Found the way to himself and to life. Written the night before his death, by a young man who had been an architecture student, a poet, an artist, a member of a youth group, a refugee, a conspirator, a prisoner, and, for 43 days, an American. He was 21 years old. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 4, 1937, Helmut Hirsch was executed by decapitation at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The same prison where, 7 years later, participants in the July 20th plot against Hitler would also be executed. The same method, the same room. The difference was that in 1944, those conspirators would be remembered as heroes of the German resistance. In 1937, Helmut Hirsch was described in the official verdict as the stateless Jew. Even his American citizenship, even the diplomatic intervention of the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere, could not override a single word. Jew. There is a detail about this case that historians have noted, but that rarely makes it into popular accounts. The Black Front, the organization that recruited Helmut, that gave him purpose and direction and a target, was not a Jewish organization. It was a German nationalist organization. Its leader, Otto Strasser, had been a Nazi. Its ideology was a variant of the same nationalist fever that had produced the regime it opposed. Helmut Hirsch, a Jewish young man driven from his country by racial laws, found his avenue for resistance not through Jewish networks, not through Zionist organizations, not through the established Jewish community, which, as in many countries during this period, counseled caution and quiet diplomacy, but through a faction of dissident German nationalists who happened to share his enemy, if not his identity. And the organization that gave him this avenue had already been compromised. The Gestapo knew his name before he boarded the train. The bomb was designed to kill him. The mission was, in all probability, a trap from the beginning. Helmut Hirsch was not defeated by the Nazi regime because his plan was flawed or because he lacked courage. He was defeated because the regime was already inside the room when the plan was made. This raises a question that the historical record does not answer cleanly, but that the facts force us to confront. Did Otto Strasser know? Did Heinrich Grunow, the handler who used the code name Dr. Beer, know that the operation was compromised? Did anyone in the Black Front leadership understand that they were sending a 20-year-old Jewish student into a trap? with a bomb designed to kill him even if he reached his target? The evidence is not conclusive. What is documented is that the Black Front's security was catastrophically penetrated, that at least one double agent provided detailed testimony at Helmut's trial, and that the bomb's construction was inconsistent with a mission intended to allow the bomber to survive. Whether this represents incompetence, infiltration, or something worse, is a question that the sealed records of the Volksgerichtshof and the destroyed files of the Black Front cannot definitively resolve. What can be resolved is what Helmut Hirsch left behind. His sister Katie survived the war. She emigrated to the United States, married, took the name Sugarman, and spent decades preserving her brother's memory. She donated his personal papers to Brandeis University: letters, diaries, notebooks, poems, short stories, architectural drawings, photographic scrapbooks, and the final letter from Plötzensee. These materials are not the relics of a terrorist. They are the archive of a young man who loved buildings and poetry, who sketched obsessively, who joined a youth group and made friends and fell in love and was expelled from his own country because of who his parents were. The Brandeis collection includes materials that Katie translated from German to English herself, determined that the archive would be accessible to researchers who could not read her brother's native language. In Stuttgart, at Seestrasse 89, there is a Stolperstein, one of the small brass memorial stones embedded in sidewalks across Europe to mark the last freely chosen residences of victims of National Socialism. The inscription reads, "Here lived Helmut Hirsch, born 1916, arrested in the resistance on 20th of December 1936, murdered on 4th of June 1937 in Berlin Plötzensee." The stone uses the word murdered, not executed, not sentenced, murdered, and it identifies him explicitly as a member of the resistance, a classification that took decades to achieve, because Helmut Hirsch did not fit neatly into the categories that post-war memory created for resistance fighters. He was not a communist partisan. He was not a member of the White Rose. He was not a military officer who turned against the regime. He was a Jewish student with a revolver and a train ticket, sent into a trap by an organization that was not Jewish to bomb a building he never reached, with explosives he never touched, on behalf of a cause that was not entirely his own. And yet, the Stolperstein says resistance. The Brandeis archive says resistance. The diplomatic record of the United States of America, filed under Foreign Relations 1937, says that this case mattered enough for the Secretary of State and the ambassador to Germany to spend political capital on a 21-year-old who had tried to fight back. A publication issued on the 50th anniversary of Helmut Hirsch's death, preserved in the Brandeis collection, contains his letters, poems, and drawings. It was produced in Germany, in the country that killed him. 50 years later, a German publisher printed his poems, his architectural sketches, the letter he wrote the night before they cut off his head. The book exists as a kind of answer to the radio broadcast of March 20th, 1937, when the announcer called him the stateless Jew and read out his death sentence between program segments. 50 years later, Germany gave him back his name. But the larger world did not. Helmut Hirsch remains almost unknown. He does not appear in most histories of Jewish resistance. He's not mentioned in standard Holocaust education curricula. His case is absent from the permanent exhibitions of most major Holocaust museums. When researchers at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York explored the story of Herschel Grinspan, the 17-year-old who shot a German diplomat in Paris in 1938, triggering the pretext for Kristallnacht, they noted that Grinspan himself had largely been forgotten. Helmut Hirsch is forgotten even among the forgotten. Part of the reason is timing. Hirsch was arrested in December 1936 and executed in June 1937. This was before Kristallnacht, before the annexation of Austria, before the invasion of Poland, before the ghettos, before the Einsatzgruppen, before Auschwitz. In the chronology of the Holocaust, Helmut Hirsch exists in a strange precursor zone, a period when the persecution of Jews in Germany was severe and accelerating, but had not yet reached the industrial scale of mass murder. His act of resistance preceded the catastrophe it was trying to prevent. And because it failed, because he never reached Nuremberg, never picked up the suitcases, never detonated a single charge, it registered as a footnote rather than an event. But there is another reason for the forgetting, and it is more uncomfortable. Helmut Hirsch chose violence. He chose to bomb a building. He joined a paramilitary organization. He carried a revolver. In the post-war construction of Holocaust memory, Jewish resistance was most comfortably remembered when it took the form of spiritual endurance, cultural preservation, hidden children, forged documents, and when armed resistance was acknowledged, large-scale uprisings like the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt of 1943, which could be framed as a last stand of collective heroism. Individual Jewish acts of violence against the Nazi regime, Hirsch's planned bombing, Grinchpan's assassination, David Frankfurter's shooting of Wilhelm Gustloff in 1936, sat uneasily in this framework. They were too individual, too impulsive, too entangled with non-Jewish political movements, and too easily used by the Nazis as propaganda. The Jewish communities of the 1930s condemned or distanced themselves from these acts for understandable strategic reasons. The post-war memory establishment continued the pattern for different but equally understandable reasons. The result is that Helmut Hirsch fell through the cracks of remembrance. Consider what the record actually shows. A 20-year-old Jewish man, expelled from his own country's universities, who decided, correctly as history proved, that the Nazi regime intended to destroy Jewish life in Europe, who joined the only organization that offered him a path to fight back, who boarded a train knowing he might not return, who wavered on that train because he was human and traveled to his hometown to see a friend one last time, who was arrested, tried in secret, and sentenced to death for a crime he did not complete, whose family learned of his sentence from a radio broadcast, who became an American citizen through a bureaucratic race against time, whose case went to Hitler's desk, who was denied clemency by the most powerful man in Europe, who wrote the night before his execution that he had found the way to himself and to life, who was decapitated at dawn and who left behind poems and architectural drawings, and a sister who carried his papers across an ocean and gave them to a university so that someone someday might remember. In December of 1936, a young Jewish man boarded a train in Prague. He told his parents he was going skiing. 89 years later, there is a brass stone in the sidewalk of Seestrasse 89, Stuttgart. It is 4 inches square. You have to look down to see it. Most people walk right over it. But if you stop, and if you read the inscription, you will find the name of a boy who tried to bomb the heart of the Reich before the world understood what the Reich intended to do. He failed. He was betrayed. He was killed. And the building he wanted to destroy, it still stood in Nuremberg for 8 more years, until Allied bombers, flying in formations of hundreds, finally did what Helmut Hirsch had tried to do alone, with 2 suitcases and a revolver, at the age of 20.